the biggest games of 2025 is another monster from Capcom, shipping on PC alongside PS5, PS5 Pro, and Xbox Series X and S. The latest entry in the long-running and hugely successful franchise is pushing both the platforms and Capcom's in-house proprietary technology hard. The technical and performance issues we covered in our Dragon's Dogma 2 review last year are still fresh in our minds, and they are even harder to ignore in Monster Hunter Wilds. Believe it or not, but Capcom's RE engine is now almost as old as the MT framework engine it replaced. Since its introduction with 2017's Resident Evil 7, the RE engine has powered most of Capcom's biggest games, and 7 years in, the engine is starting to show its age. Photogrammetry, the process of taking photos or digital scans of real-world objects, textures and humans, and then digitizing them as in-game assets, was a key pillar in the photorealistic look that the recent Resident Evil games are known for and aimed for, along with a confined and linear experience with which to play and explore. But with Wilds, the team has focused on more of a stylized, pastel-coloured dream state art style. The result is in keeping with its franchise roots, with a more flamboyant, dynamic and dense design than before. Now, a big change right from the start compared to all prior RE engine games on PC and consoles is the removal of Capcom's own proprietary upscaling technique entitled Interlaced in the PC menu. The system was still in use with noted issues in last year's Dragon's Dogma 2 as well as the Wilds open beta earlier this month. This checkerboard rendering method takes a lower resolution base and interleaves the rendered pixels with prior frames colour and pixel data, along with motion vectors, to reconstruct a higher resolution quality image for less cost. As the name suggests, this works by rendering every even and then odd pixel across the 2 frames, essentially jittering the render across frame 1 and 2, and this checkerboard pattern is then completed using the buffered data and motion information from the previous frame to fill in the blanks, resulting in a perceived 4K-like image. Now, although good for its time, the rendering and upscaling world has moved on, and so has Capcom.
But we can go over!
Eschewing its own solution between the beta and launch and expanding across multiple options, the PS5 Pro now exclusively uses Sony's own PlayStation Spectral Super Resolution, PSSR, while AMD's Fidelity FX Super Resolution, FSR1, is the only option of choice for both PS5 Series X and S. Meanwhile, on PC, players with an NVIDIA RTX graphics card get NVIDIA's Deep Learning Super Sampling, DLSS 3.7, while all players can choose between AMD's Fidelity FX Super Resolution, FSR3, or Intel's Xe Super Sampling, XeSS 1.3. Now, finally, for those with the power, it still offers native resolutions with TAA and FXAA, and these newer solutions are far more intelligent and offer better image quality, stability, and compatibility across all the platforms that Capcom supports. However, the results can vary greatly across each platform, which we'll get into next. The shift over to the RE engine from MT frameworks that powered Monster Hunter World would have been a significant enough challenge on its own, but many artistic and technical decisions from that game are brought along as well. The prior world used an obvious dithering filter on objects that draw close to the camera, creating a soft mesh fade out as trees, grass, people, and even NPCs draw close and through the camera. Now, the aim is to reduce the obvious pop-in of objects between multiple frames rather than having them appear suddenly. But due to the proximity to your view, the sheer amount of pop in and out the game has, as well as the monotone colour scheme in many areas, can make these visual blights more obvious. Another issue is the use of distance-based update cycles for NPCs and monsters. This makes a great deal of sense due to the abundance of them in the world in order to improve CPU memory and GPU time and space. Again, due to the temporal buffers and TAA, it blurs pixels very heavily. These can become an incredible eyesore in camps and out in the world. What makes this more galling is even though these issues can be improved on PC, they cannot be fully removed even on the very best PCs money can buy. And these issues can impact a huge portion of the game's visual presentation across console and PC alike. The game can look good at times, most specifically in the real-time and artistically driven cinematics, which highlight the excellent use of colour, lighting, textures and animation that combine with the engine's great post-effect suite of high-quality depth of field and motion blur. However, during gameplay, the seams that hold it all together show through quickly. Most issues stem from the engine's reliance on textures and materials to deliver much of the detail and impact, and as noted at the start, the RE engine was designed to deliver photorealism via photogrammetry, which includes characters, skin, hair, objects, buildings. With Monster Hunter Wilds, the art direction isn't aiming for that same realism. Instead, it goes for a more painters-like cartoon presentation. This means that much of the physically based rendering, PBR, that the engine relies on cannot be used, aside from some edge cases, leaving much of the world details, characters and monsters looking flat and last generation. Faces, although well designed, with some level of skin shading, are not well animated and rely heavily on the lighting within the scene. The lack of good bidirectional reflectance distribution functions, this is the lighting calculations required for physically based surface reactions such as wood, metal, skin, within much of the game's objects and materials, is the main culprit, at least during gameplay, with the real-time cutscenes being handcrafted to lean into the discussed strengths of the engine. Much of this comes down to the game's most impactful and damning issues: texture quality, streaming, and memory management, which we'll discuss in a moment. Ray tracing is exclusive to the PS5 Pro version in its resolution or balance mode and on PC. It largely consists of ray trace reflections on water bodies and certain materials, in addition to a sun-based global illumination and ambient occlusion pass. Now, despite these features, the world depth and solidity are lacking, both in long and short vistas, as the team relies heavily on volumetric fog, clouds, and some form of emulated atmospheric scattering for depth. These require the normal maps, the noise, albedo maps, and pure texture map surface detail to create much of the world's look and feel. But these place a high demand on the engine to keep resident in VRAM, meaning constant data streaming in and out. On consoles, this can impact performance and visual quality, most significantly on the memory-limited Xbox Series S, but also on the bigger consoles to a lesser degree. These problems are exacerbated by the use of AMD's FSR1 on base consoles. Now, due to the key architectural differences of the PC platform, these are increased storage, bandwidth, and throughput demands compared to the console's single unified memory pool. This translates to any GPU with 8GB or possibly even 10GB of VRAM struggling to maintain the balance of textures at all times in play. Taking my RTX 4050 laptop with 6GB of VRAM as a worst case, but still within their minimum specifications, we quickly see why Capcom recommends upscaling and even frame generation technologies to achieve 1080-60. On this machine, using a mix of low and medium settings with medium textures, no ray tracing, setting the game to 1080p output using DLSS 3.7 set at the quality level, which is a 1280 by 720p base, we are often running at or around 30 FPS. During the opening section and battles, the machine can stay close to that required 33 millisecond frame times, but can still jump up to 60 milliseconds or more, causing stutters from time to time, such as when the camera moves quickly during play, camera cuts during cinematics, or travelling through the world at key sector loading points, the last of which are the most impactful and can cause much longer stutters across all my tested machines.
The one that's larger than the rest is their alpha.
Now that said, at these settings we're still mostly GPU bound on this machine, but here we can still flip-flop between data memory bound and then CPU bound due to the heavy CPU load all the streaming places on the machine. Now, due to the game's use of frustum culling of objects, which is the camera's viewport, it consistently is loading and destroying objects from memory on a frame-by-frame basis. Now, the game uses DX12's Direct Storage API, but based on the main menu specs of my tests, it appears to only use the CPU for the decompression work rather than the GPU. Now, this may be a bug, and it may indeed use the GPU in part or based on driver or texture setting, but the game does appear to be CPU limited on every machine I tested. Whenever data is required to be moved back and forth from the SSD, system RAM and VRAM, the GPU can stall or create a bubble that underutilizes it while the data is in transit. Now on consoles, specifically the PS5 and PS5 Pro, this is all offloaded work via the SSD, the I/O blocks, and the DMA-like access patterns, aided further by the single pool of RAM. Now this is true to a lesser degree on the Xbox Series X and Series S machines as well, which also uses the same DirectX 12 Direct Storage API as PC, and will certainly use the CPU and GPU in combination to minimize the impact of this data streaming challenge. This all helps the performance levels on consoles over PC. On PC, we see performance impacts and high system and VRAM usage regularly due to these data demands, even at such relatively low settings and texture quality. During my tests, I often saw more than 8 GB of system RAM used by the game and as much of the VRAM available to the game. After an hour or so of play, my RTX 4050 laptop was quickly RAM limited, with textures either being of a very low bitmap quality or missing entire layers. This presents the game's key weakness, those virtual texture demands, and it adds to the reason why the game can look last generation due to the low polygon count of many things within the world, the low texture fidelity and filtering, and at its worst, missing texture details completely. And this is not just an issue for entry-level machines. It can still happen, though at a lower frequency, on larger GPUs, pointing to a potential memory management issue remaining within the engine. Now, the team appears to be aware of this, as a gigantic 70GB high-quality texture pack is available for PC players, which bumps the game's 60GB base footprint up by more than double. Now, by installing these high quality textures, we can see a massive increase in the game's texture details and fidelity, resulting in, at times, a generational gap between the base and HQ versions. But the cost of this is an even bigger performance hit and overhead penalty for your PC. As a base, these textures require 16GB GPUs based on Capcom's own specs, but currently, even those GPUs can struggle with the high quality pack installed. My RX 6800 suffers even more with these enabled during those same data streaming and decompression functions, which translates to even worse GPU utilization and lower frame times. Now, this comes from that heavy reliance on data streaming and memory management. Compounding the negatives of this 70GB HD texture pack is that even my RTX 4090 with 24GB of RAM and a Ryzen 7 5800X 3D CPU is impacted just as much. The CPU is constantly maxed out, streaming the data in and out, leaving the GPU underutilized. VRAM usage can now exceed 18GB, some 4 to 5GB more than when the textures are set to high, and even crashed on me twice, pointing to possible buffer limit access or even memory leaks. Now, this all makes sense as to why they are an extra for PC, as even the PS5 Pro, with its 1GB of extra RAM available for games, runs the same base texture pack as all of the machines, and that also crashed on me a couple of times. Now, this would be where I suggest optimal settings, but for the PC the options are small. At a high level, I would say set any mid-range GPU to 1440p using DLSS 3, FSR 3 or XESS at balance or quality if possible. Reduce memory impactful settings such as textures, mesh quality, shadows, ambient lighting and ray tracing to low or off to ensure you have a cushion of around 1 to 2GB of VRAM remaining. This should mitigate the expensive streaming costs, improving your CPU time and thus allow your GPU to deliver closer to its theoretical limit.
A giant bigger wasp. I guess they prefer the plenty too.
For high-end 16GB plus GPUs, now I wouldn't recommend installing the HD pack, but if you do and set it to high, you still get the benefit of some of those extra bitmaps. And again, this means that you maintain a level of 1 to 2GB of VRAM buffer, but at 4K upscaled using your upscaler of choice, which presents the best balance of image quality and performance.
Sure are a lot of monsters there.
Crash right into them!
We're still too far away.
What do we do? Hold on. What's that?
Now, the PlayStation 5 Pro is by far the best way to play on consoles. It uses Sony's PSSR upscaling, which delivers a far more stable and cleaner image than base consoles FSR1, although it can be softer. Frame rate mode renders the game at a base 1920 by 1080 and appears to use PSSR in a super sampled mode, similar to AMD's FSR native AA or Nvidia's DLLA. This means the game has less shimmer and breakup than we see in the other consoles, and this mode also presents the best performance, with a close to locked 60 FPS or even higher when run on a 120Hz screen using the unlocked mode. Now, I saw frame rates often into the low 80s or high 70s, far from a 120 FPS game, but it does at least manage to present quite consistent frame times. It can still stutter at times, but this is less frequent than any other machine tested, and therefore frame rate is the best way to play on PS5 Pro. Even if it's not the best image quality, it's certainly the best gameplay experience and input latency. Now, next is the balance mode, which can be locked to 40 FPS, again requiring a 120Hz screen, and this does indeed present the best balance, offering a slightly reduced level of ray tracing compared to the resolution mode, but feeling far smoother than that mode's 30 FPS rate, which can also be unlocked, but it's often close enough to that 30 FPS level to not be worth it, as the inconsistent frame times this can bring. Now, this does represent the best visual quality though, with PSSR upscaling. Both balance and resolution mode use a dynamic level between 1260p to 1800p respectively, all the way up to 4K using PSSR.
Looks like it knows the way.
The PS5 and Xbox Series X trade blows in the resolution mode, which both use FSR1 4K from a dynamic 1404 or 1800p base, with balance weighted more to the lower bounds of these levels.
Exceptionally agitated. Could they be chasing something?
It's a person!
Then the frame rate mode again uses FSR1 from a 1280-720 up to 1920 by 1080 target. Now we see the slightly wider Xbox Series X GPU having a small but noted increase over the PS5 in its resolution mode to the tune of around 2 to 4% at best, and again in the cinematic sequences, which are more GPU bound. The balance mode closes them up much closer to be practically identical, and then the frame rate mode pushes the PS5 ahead, with the Sony console taking the lead on average to a slightly larger 4 to 6% in the tested sections here. Again though, these are very small and are only visible if you use the unlocked 120Hz mode to allow the console to max out their performance headroom and when streaming is at its highest, and really without this graph you probably wouldn't notice either. Now, I found the balance mode at 120Hz to be the best balance of image quality versus performance, but even this can dip below 40 FPS on both machines during play. Now, the frame rate mode does achieve 60 FPS levels okay on both, but the PS5 and Series X can again dip below that level, often with frame times being the biggest issue, hitting 8, 16, 33, 41 and even 100 milliseconds often enough to make it best to run at a 120Hz screen if you have one, but still expect stutters in base camps and sector points, with the Series X impacted most, but the PS5 doesn't get away with it either. Finally, the Xbox Series S struggles the most in all areas discussed. Image quality is by far the worst, being a 1920 by 1080p output at best, and then either appearing to dynamically scale down to around 900p and possibly even lower, or due to the game's TAA appearing very soft and noisy almost all the time. Even in comparison to the frame rate mode on the bigger consoles, the Series S image is far muddier, unstable, and generally much worse at a 1080p target. Compounding this are those texture issues, with the Series S suffering badly with the lowest level of bitmaps, objects blurring together in the foreground and background, and presents a much lower presentation of the team's aims than we see on the other consoles. Sadly no, this is not balanced with performance, as only a single mode is available here, along with a 120Hz option which is only included to check the headroom. What we see is a game that cannot maintain 30 FPS consistently, and more specifically 33 millisecond frame times, often dropping below during combat and out in the wild, with prolonged dips into the mid-20s. Unlocking the frame rate is of no use, as we do not have any meaningful headroom left over here to see an increase, leaving it the worst place to play on consoles.
Tread carefully.
Monster Hunter Wilds has come with huge expectations and already achieved record sales over the launch weekend. However, the experience across the customer base is a varied and troubled one. The use of upscaling and frame generation for PCs to achieve basic 1080 60 or 4K 60 depending on entry or top-end hardware is not something that should be expected or accepted. Based on my tests, which includes 4 patches released from Capcom since launch, the game cannot maintain a locked 60 FPS level even on the highest end PC GPUs and high-end CPUs. With frame generation, the game can achieve a smoother display, but at the cost of lower input latency and some significant visual artifacts that come from the use of frame interpolation solutions. And it's far from a solution to the core problem, which is that without it, even my RTX 4090 can dip below 60 FPS when moving through the world or turning the camera. The console versions do suffer less from these performance issues, although only the PS5 Pro offers anything close to a genuine 60 FPS, and even that has some hiccups and its own image quality issues. From a technical standpoint, the final results you see on screen do not reflect the mammoth requirements they demand. Image quality is not bad, with some good-looking cinematic sequences, but the problems that arise from attempting to deliver a vast, seamless landscape from an engine designed for linear, confined games are even more glaringly obvious here than with Dragon's Dogma 2. Patches will continue to come on all formats, and they are sorely needed. But as of right now, the result on consoles, and most certainly PC, fall far below those lofty expectations many of us had to monster up into the wilds. And that's it for all things Monster Hunter PC, console and video frame rate game related. If you like what we do here on IGN Performance Reviews, then keep it IGN, and we'll catch you on the next one.